Welcome to Voice of the Pages, the Decameron of Giovanni Boccaccio. Day the 6th. Here beginneth the 6th day of the Decameron, wherein, under the governance of Elisa, is discoursed of whoso, being assailed with some gibing speech, hath vindicated himself, or hath, with some ready reply or advisement, escaped loss, peril, or shame. The moon, being now in the middest heaven, had lost its radiance, and every part of our world was bright with the new coming light, when, the queen arising and letting call her company, they all with slow step fared forth and rambled over the dewy grass to a little distance from the fair hill, holding various discourse of one thing and another, and debating of the more or less goodliness of the stories told. What while they renewed their laughter at the various adventures related therein, till such time as the sun mounting high, and beginning to wax hot, it seemed well to them all to turn homeward. Wherefore, reversing their steps, they returned to the palace, and there, by the queen's commandment, the tables being already laid, and everything strewn with sweet-scented herbs and fair flowers, they addressed themselves to eat, ere the heat should grow greater. This being joyously accomplished, ere they did other what, they sang divers goodly and pleasant canzonets, after which some went to sleep, whilst some sat down to play at chess, and other some at tables, and Dionio fell to singing, in concert with Loretta, of Troilus and Cressida. Then, the hour come for their reassembling after the wonted fashion, they all, being summoned on the part of the queen, seated themselves, as of their usance, about the fountain. But as she was about to call for the first story, there befell a thing that had not yet befallen there, to wit, that a great clamour was heard by her and by all, made by the wenches and serving men in the kitchen. The seneschal, being called and questioned who it was that cried thus, and what might be the occasion of the turmoil, answered that the clamour was between Lysiska and Tindaro, but that he knew not the cause thereof, being but then come thither to make them bide quiet, whenas he had been summoned on her part. The queen bade him incontinent fetch thither the two offenders, and they being come, inquired what was the cause of their clamour, whereto Tindaro offering to reply, Lysiska, who was well in years and somewhat overmasterful, being heated with the outcry she had made, turned to him with an angry air and said, "Mark this brood of a man who dareth to speak before me, whereas I am. Let me speak." Then, turning again to the queen, "Madam," quoth she, "this fellow would teach me, forsooth, to know Sycophantes' wife, and neither more nor less than as if I had not been familiar with her, would fain give me to believe that, the first night her husband lay with her, Squire Mall made his entry into Black Hill by force, and with effusion of blood, and I say that it is not true, nay, he entered there in peace and to the great contentment of those within. Marry, this fellow is simple enough to believe wenches to be such ninnies that they stand to lose their time, abiding the commodity of their fathers and brothers, who 6 times out of 7 tarry 3 or 4 years more than they should to marry them. Well would they fare, forsooth, were they to wait so long. By Christ his faith, and I should know what I say, when I swear thus, I have not a single gossip who went a maid to her husband, and as for the wives, I know full well how many and what tricks they play their husbands, and this blockhead would teach me to know women, as if I had been born yesterday." What while Lysiska spoke, the ladies kept up such a laughing that you might have drawn all their teeth, and the queen imposed silence upon her a good 6 times, but to no purpose. She stinted not till she had said her say. When she had at last made an end of her talk, the queen turned to Dionio and said, laughing, "Dionio, this is a matter for thy jurisdiction, wherefore, when we shall have made an end of our stories, thou shalt proceed to give final judgment thereon." Whereto he answered promptly, "Madam, the judgment is already given, without hearing more of the matter, and I say that Lysiska is in the right and opine that it is even as she saith, and that Tindaro is an ass." Lysiska, hearing this, fell a-laughing, and turning to Tindaro, said, "I told thee so, begone and God go with thee. Thinkest thou knowest better than I, thou whose eyes are not yet dry? Gramercy, I have not lived here below for nothing, no, not I." And had not the queen with an angry air imposed silence on her, and sent her and Tindaro away, bidding her make no more words or clamour, and she would not be flogged. They had naught to do all that day but attend to her. When they were gone, the queen called on Philomena to make a beginning with the day's stories, and she blithely began thus. The first story. A gentleman engageth to Madame Oretta to carry her a horseback with a story, but, telling it disorderly, is prayed by her to set her down again. Young ladies, like as stars in the clear nights, are the ornaments of the heavens and the flowers and the leaf-clad shrubs, in the spring, of the green fields and the hillsides, even so are praiseworthy manners and goodly discourse adorned by sprightly sallies, the which, for that they are brief, beseem women yet better than men, inasmuch as much speaking is more forbidden to the former than to the latter. Yet, true it is, whatever the cause, whether it be the meanness of our understanding or some particular grudge borne by heaven to our times, that there be nowadays few or no women left who know how to say a witty word in due season, or who, and it be said to them, know how to apprehend it as it behoveth, the which is a general reproach to our whole sex. However, for that enough hath been said aforetime on the subject by Pampinia, I purpose to say no more thereof, but to give you to understand how much goodliness there is in witty sayings, when spoken in due season. It pleaseth me to recount to you the courteous fashion in which a lady imposed silence upon a gentleman. As many of you ladies may either know by sight or have heard tell, there was not long since in our city a noble and well-bred and well-spoken gentlewoman, whose worth merited not that her name be left unsaid. She was called, then, Madame Oretta, and was the wife of Messer Jerry Spina. She chanced to be, as we are, in the country, going from place to place, by way of diversion, with a company of ladies and gentlemen, whom she had that day entertained to dinner at her house. And the way being belike somewhat long from the place whence they set out to that whither they were all purposed to go afoot, one of the gentlemen said to her, Madame Oretta, an you will, I will carry you a horseback great part of the way we have to go with one of the finest stories in the world. Nay, sir, answered the lady, I pray you instantly thereof. Indeed, it will be most agreeable to me. Master Cavalier, who maybe fared no better, sword at side than tail on tongue, hearing this, began a story of his, which of itself was in truth very goodly, but he now thrice or four or even half a dozen times repeating one same word, anon turning back and while saying, I said not aright, and often erring in the names and putting one for another, marred it cruelly, more by token that he delivered himself exceedingly ill. Having regard to the quality of the persons and the nature of the incidents of his tale. By reason whereof, Madame Oretta, hearkening to him, was many a time taken with a sweat and failing of the heart, as she were sick and near her end, and at last, being unable to brook the thing any more, and seeing the gentleman engaged in an imbroglio from which he was not like to extricate himself, she said to him pleasantly, Sir, this horse of yours hath too hard a trot, wherefore I pray you be pleased to set me down. The gentleman, who, as it chanced, understood a hint better than he told a story, took the jest in good part, and turning it off with a laugh, fell to discoursing of other matters, and left unfinished the story that he had begun and conducted so ill. The second story. Sisti the baker, with a word of his fashion mocketh Messer Jerry Spina, sensible of an indiscreet request of his. Madame Oretta's saying was greatly commended of all, ladies and men, and the queen bidding Pampinia follow on, she began thus, Fair ladies, I know not of mine own motion to resolve me which is the more at fault. Whether nature in fitting to a noble soul a mean body, or fortune in imposing a mean condition upon a body endowed with a noble soul, as in one our townsman Sisti, and in many another we may have seen it happen, which Sisti being gifted with a very lofty spirit, fortune made him a baker. And for this, certes, I should curse both nature and fortune like, did I not know the one to be most discreet, and the other to have 1,000 eyes, albeit fools picture her blind, and I imagine, therefore, that, being exceeding well advised, they do that which is oftentimes done of human beings who, uncertain of future events, bury their most precious things against their occasions in the meanest places of their houses as being the least suspect, and thence bring them forth in their greatest needs, the mean place having the while kept them more surely than would the goodly chamber. And so, meseemeth, do the governors of the world hide oftentimes their most precious things under the shadow of crafts and conditions reputed most mean, to the end that, bringing them forth therefrom in time of need, their lustre may show the brighter. Which how Sisti the baker made manifest, though in but a trifling matter, restoring to Messer Jerry Spina, whom the story but now told of Madame Oretta, who was his wife, hath recalled to my memory, the eyes of the understanding. It pleaseth me to show you in a very short story. I must tell you, then, that Pope Boniface, with whom Messer Jerry Spina was in very great favour, having dispatched to Florence certain of his gentlemen on an embassy concerning sundry important matters of his, they lighted down at the house of Messer Jerry, and he treating the Pope's affairs in company with them, it chanced, whatever might have been the occasion thereof, that he and they passed well nigh every morning afoot before Santa Maria Uggi, where Sisti the baker had his bakehouse and plied his craft in person. Now, albeit fortune had appointed Sisti a humble enough condition, she had so far at the least been kind to him therein that he was grown very rich, and without ever choosing to abandon it for any other, lived very splendidly, having, amongst his other good things, the best wines, white and red, that were to be found in Florence or in the neighboring country. Seeing Messer Jerry and the Pope's ambassadors pass every morning before his door, and the heat being great, he bethought himself that it were a great courtesy to give them to drink of his good white wine, but, having regard to his own condition and that of Messer Jerry, he deemed it not a seemly thing to presume to invite them, but determined to bear himself on such wise as should lead Messer Jerry to invite himself. Accordingly, having still on his body a very white doublet and an apron fresh from the wash, which bespoke him rather a miller than a baker, he let set before his door, every morning, towards the time when he looked for Messer Jerry and the ambassadors to pass, a new tin pail of fair water and a small pitcher of new bolognese ware, full of his good white wine, together with 2 beakers, which seemed of silver, so bright they were, and seated himself there, against they should pass, when, after clearing his throat once or twice, he fell to drinking of that his wine with such a relish that he had made a dead man's mouth water for it. Messer Jerry, having seen him do thus 1 and 2 mornings, said on the 3rd, How now, Sisti? Is it good? Whereupon he started to his feet and said, Aye is it, sir, but how good I cannot give you to understand, except you taste thereof. Messer Jerry, in whom either the nature of the weather or belike the relish with which he saw Sisti drink had begotten a thirst, turned to the ambassadors and said, Smiling gentlemen, we shall do well to taste this honest man's wine. Belike it is such that we shall not repent thereof. Accordingly, he made with them towards Sisti, who let bring a goodly settle out of his bakehouse, and praying them sit, said to their serving men, who pressed forward to rinse the beakers, Stand back, friends, and leave this office to me. For that I know no less well how to skink than to wield the baking peel, and look you not to taste a drop thereof. So saying, he with his own hands washed out 4 new and goodly beakers, and letting bring a little pitcher of his good wine, busied himself with giving Messer Jerry and his companions to drink, to whom the wine seemed the best they had drunken that great while, wherefore they commended it greatly, and well nigh every morning, whilst the ambassadors abode there, Messer Jerry went thither to drink in company with them. After a while, their business being dispatched and they about to depart, Messer Jerry made them a magnificent banquet, whereto he bade a number of the most worshipful citizens, and amongst the rest, Sisti, who would, however, on no condition go thither. Whereupon Messer Jerry bade one of his serving men go fetch a flask of the baker's wine, and give each guest a half beaker thereof with the first course. The servant, despiteful most like for that he had never availed to drink of the wine, took a great flagon, which when Sisti saw, My son, said he, Messer Jerry sent thee not to me. The man avouched again and again that he had, but, getting none other answer, returned to Messer Jerry and reported it to him. Quoth he, Go back to him, and tell him that I do indeed send thee to him, and if he still make thee the same answer, ask him to whom I send thee, and it be not to him. Accordingly, the servant went back to the baker, and said to him, Sisti, for certain Messer Jerry sendeth me to thee, and none other. For certain, my son, answered the baker, he doth it not. Then said the man, To whom doth he send me? To the Arno, replied Sisti, which answer when the servant reported to Messer Jerry, the eyes of his understanding were of a sudden opened, and he said to the man, Let me see what flask thou carriedst thither. When he saw the great flagon aforesaid, he said, Sisti saith sooth, and giving the man a sharp reproof, made him take a sortable flask, which when Sisti saw, Now, quoth he, I know full well that he sendeth thee to me, and cheerfully filled it unto him. Then, that same day, he let fill a little cask with the like wine, and causing carry it softly to Messer Jerry's house, went presently thither, and finding him there, said to him, Sir, I would not have you think that the great flagon of this morning frightened me, nay, but meseeming that which I have of these past days shown you with my little pitchers had escaped your mind, to wit, that this is no household wine, I wished to recall it to you. But now, for that I purpose no longer to be your steward thereof, I have sent it all to you, henceforward do with it as it pleaseth you. Messer Jerry set great store by Sisti's present, and rendering him such thanks as he deemed sortable, ever after held him for a man of great worth and for friend. The third story. Madame Nonada Pulsi, with a ready retort to a not altogether seemly pleasantry, imposeth silence on the Bishop of Florence. Pampinia having made an end of her story, and both Sisti's reply and his liberality having been much commended of all, it pleased the queen that the next story should be told by Loretta, who blithely began as follows, Jocund ladies, First Pampinia and now Philomena have spoken truly enough touching our little worth and the excellence of pithy sayings, whereto that there may be no need now to return, I would fain remind you, over and above that which hath been said on the subject, that the nature of smart sayings is such that they should bite upon the hearer, not as the dog, but as the sheep biteth, for that, an a trait bit like a dog, it were not a trait, but an affront. The right mean in this was excellently well hit both by Madame Oretta's speech and Sisti's reply. It is true that, if a smart thing be said by way of retort, and the answerer biteth like a dog, having been bitten on likewise, meseemeth he is not to be blamed as he would have been, had this not been the case, wherefore it behoveth us look how and with whom, no less than when and where, we bandy jests, to which considerations, a prelate of ours, taking too little heed, received at least as sharp a bite as he thought to give, as I shall show you in a little story. Messer Antonio d'Orso, a learned and worthy prelate, being Bishop of Florence, there came thither a Catalan gentleman, called Messer Diego della Rata, marshal for King Robert, who, being a man of a very fine person and a great amorist, took a liking to one among other Florentine ladies, a very fair lady and granddaughter to a brother of the said bishop, and hearing that her husband, albeit a man of good family, was very sordid and miserly, agreed with him to give him 500 gold florins, so he would suffer him lie a night with his wife. Accordingly, he let gild so many silver poplins, a coin which was then current, and having lain with the lady, though against her will, gave them to the husband. The thing after coming to be known everywhere, the sordid wretch of a husband reaped both loss and scorn, but the bishop, like a discreet man as he was, affected to know nothing of the matter. Wherefore, he and the marshal consorting much together, it chanced, as they rode side by side with each other, one St. John's day, viewing the ladies on either side of the way where the mantle is run for, the prelate espied a young lady, of whom this present pestilence hath bereft us, and whom all you ladies must have known, Madame Nonada Pulsi by name, cousin to Messer Alessio Ranucci, a fresh and fair young woman, both well-spoken and high-spirited, then not long before married in Porta San Piero, and pointed her out to the marshal. Then, being near her, He laid his hand on the latter's shoulder and said to her, Nana, how deemest thou of this gallant? Thinkest thou couldst make a conquest of him? It seemed to the lady that those words somewhat trenched upon her honor and were like to sully it in the eyes of those, and there were many there, who heard them. Wherefore, not thinking to purge away the soil, but to return blow for blow, she promptly answered, Maybe, sir, he would not make a conquest of me, but in any case, I should want good money. The marshal and the bishop, hearing this, felt themselves alike touched to the quick by her speech, the one as the author of the cheat put upon the bishop's brother's granddaughter, and the other as having suffered the affront in the person of his kinswoman, and made off, shamefast and silent, without looking at one another, or saying aught more to her that day. Thus, then, the young lady having been bitten, it was not forbidden her to bite her biter with a retort. The fourth story. Cicibio, cook to Corrado Gianfigliazzi, with a ready word spoken to save himself, turneth his master's anger into laughter and escapeth the punishment threatened him by the latter. Loretta being silent and Nana having been mightily commended of all, the queen charged Neophile to follow on, and she said, although lovesome ladies, a ready wit doth often furnish folk with words both prompt and useful and goodly, according to the circumstances, yet fortune whiles cometh to the help of the fearful and putteth of a sudden into their mouths such answers as might never of malice aforethought be found of the speaker, as I purpose to show you by my story. Corrado Gianfigliazzi, as each of you ladies may have both heard and seen, hath still been a noble citizen of our city, liberal and magnificent, and leading a knightly life, hath ever, letting be for the present his weightier doings, taken delight in hawks and hounds, having one day with a falcon of his brought down a crane, and finding it young and fat, he sent it to a good cook he had, a Venetian hight Cicibio, bidding him roast it for supper and dress it well. Cicibio, who looked the new-caught gull he was, trussed the crane and setting it to the fire, proceeded to cook it diligently. When it was all but done and gave out a very savory smell, it chanced that a wench of the neighborhood, Brunetta by name, of whom Cicibio was sore enamored, entered the kitchen and, smelling the crane and seeing it, instantly besought him to give her a thigh thereof. He answered her, singing, and said, Thou shalt not have it from me, Mistress Brunetta, thou shalt not have it from me. Whereat she, being vexed, said to him, By God his faith, and thou give it me not, thou shalt never have of me aught that shall pleasure thee. In brief, many were the words between them, and at last, Cicibio, not to anger his mistress, cut off one of the thighs of the crane, and gave it her. The bird being after set before Messer Corrado and certain stranger guests of his, lacking a thigh, and the former marvelling thereat, he let call Cicibio and asked him what was come of the other thigh, whereto the liar of a Venetian answered without hesitation, Sir, cranes have but one thigh and one leg. What a devil! Cried Corrado in a rage. They have but one thigh and one leg? Have I never seen a crane before? Sir, replied Cicibio, it is as I tell you, and whenas it pleaseth you, I will cause you see it in the quick. Corrado, out of regard for the strangers he had with him, chose not to make more words of the matter, but said, Since thou sayst thou wilt cause me see it in the quick, a thing I never yet saw or heard tell of, I desire to see it tomorrow morning. In which case I shall be content, but I swear to thee, by Christ his body, that, an it be otherwise, I will have thee served on such wise that thou shalt still have cause to remember my name to thy sorrow so long as thou livest. There was an end of the talk for that night, but next morning, as soon as it was day, Corrado, whose anger was nothing abetted for sleep, arose, still full of wrath, and bade bring the horses. Then, mounting Cicibio upon a rounsey, he carried him off towards a watercourse on whose banks cranes were still to be seen at break of day, saying, We shall soon see who lied yestereve, thou or I. Cicibio, seeing that his master's wrath yet endured, and that needs must be made good his lie, and knowing not how he should avail thereunto, rode after Corrado in the greatest fright that might be, and fain would he have fled, so but he might. But, seeing no way of escape, He looked now before him, and now behind, and now on either side, and took all he saw for cranes standing on 2 feet. Presently, coming near to the river, he chanced to catch sight, before any other, of a round dozen of cranes on the bank, all perched on one leg, as they used to do, when they sleep, whereupon he straightway showed them to Corrado, saying, "Now, sir, if you look at those that stand yonder, you may very well see that I told you the truth yesternight, to wit, that cranes have but 1 thigh and 1 leg." Corrado, seeing them, answered, "Wait, and I will show thee that they have 2, and going somewhat nearer to them, he cried out, "Ho! Ho!" At this the cranes, putting down the other leg, all, after some steps, took to flight, whereupon Corrado said to him, "How sayst thou now, malapert knave that thou art? Deemest thou they have 2 legs? Cicibio, all confounded, and knowing not whether he stood on his head or his heels, answered, "Aye, sir, but you did not cry, Ho! Ho! To yesternight's crane. Had you cried thus, it would have put out the other thigh and the other leg, even as did those yonder." This reply so tickled Corrado that all his wrath was changed into mirth and laughter, and he said, "Cicibio, thou art in the right. Indeed, I should have done it." Thus, then, with his prompt and comical answer did Cicibio avert ill luck, and made his peace with his master. The 5th story. Messer Florence de Rabata and Master Giotto the painter, coming from Mugello, each jestingly rally at the other on his scurvy favor. Neophile being silent, and the ladies having taken much pleasure in Cicibio's reply, Pamphilo, by the queen's desire, spoke thus: "Dearest ladies, it chanceth often that, like as fortune whiles hideth very great treasures of worth and virtue under mean conditions, as hath been a little before shown by Pampinia, even so, under the sorriest of human forms are marvellous wits found to have been lodged by nature. And this very plainly appeared in 2 townsmen of ours, of whom I purpose briefly to entertain you. For that the one, who was called Messer Florence de Rabata, though little of person and misshapen, with a flat camoese face, that had been an eyesore on the shoulders of the foulest cadger in Florence, was yet of such excellence in the interpretation of the laws, that he was of many men of worth reputed a very treasury of civil right, whilst the other, whose name was Giotto, had so excellent a genius that there was nothing of all which nature, mother and mover of all things, presenteth unto us by the ceaseless revolution of the heavens, but he with pencil and pen and brush depicted it, and that so closely that not like, nay, but rather the thing itself it seemed, insomuch that men's visual sense is found to have been oftentimes deceived in things of his fashion, taking that for real which was but depictured. Wherefore, he having brought back to the light this art, which had for many an age lain buried under the errors of certain folk who painted more to divert the eyes of the ignorant than to please the understanding of the judicious, he may deservedly be styled one of the chief glories of Florence, the more so that he bore the honors he had gained with the utmost humility, and although, while he lived, chief over all else in his art, he still refused to be called master, which title, though rejected by him, shone so much the more gloriously in him as it was with greater eagerness greedily usurped by those who knew less than he, or by his disciples. Yet, great as was his skill, he was not therefore anywise goodlier of person or better favored than Messer Florence. But, to come to my story, I must tell you that Messer Florence and Giotto had each his country house at Mugello, and the former, having gone to visit his estates, at that season of the summer when the courts hold holiday, and returning thence on a sorry cart-horse, chanced to fall in with the aforesaid Giotto, who had been on the same errand, and was then on his way back to Florence nowise better equipped than himself in horse and accoutrements. Accordingly, they joined company and fared on softly, like old men as they were. Presently it chanced, as we often see it happen in summer time, that a sudden shower overtook them, from which, as quickly as they might, they took shelter in the house of a husbandman, a friend and acquaintance of both of them. After a while, the rain showing no sign of giving over, and they wishing to reach Florence by daylight, they borrowed of their host 2 old homespun cloaks and 2 hats, rusty with age, for that there were no better to be had, and set out again upon their way. When they had gone a while and were all drenched and bemired with the splashing that their hackneys kept up with their hoofs, things which used not to add worship to anyone's looks, the weather began to clear a little, and the two wayfarers, who had long fared on in silence, fell to conversing together. Messer Florence, as he rode, hearkening to Giotto, who was a very fine talker, fell to considering his companion from head to foot, and seeing him everywise so ill-accoutred and in such scurvy case, burst out laughing, and, without taking any thought to his own plight, said to him, "How sayest thou, Giotto? And there encountered us here a stranger who had never seen thee. Thinkest thou he would believe thee to be, as thou art, the finest painter in the world?" "Aye, sir," answered Giotto forthright, "methinketh he might e'en believe it when as, looking upon you, he should believe that you knew your ABC. Messer Florence, hearing this, was sensible of his error, and saw himself paid with money such as the wares he had sold." The sixth story. Michel Scolza proveth to certain young men that the cadges of Florence are the best gentlemen of the world or the Maremma, and winneth a supper. The ladies yet laughed at Giotto's prompt retort, when the queen charged Fiammetta follow on, and she proceeded to speak thus: "Young ladies, the mention by Pamphilo of the cadges of Florence, whom peradventure you know not as doth he, hath brought to my mind a story, wherein, without deviating from our appointed theme, it is demonstrated how great is their nobility, and it pleaseth me, therefore, to relate it. It is no great while since there was in our city a young man called Michel Scolza, who was the merriest and most agreeable man in the world, and he had still the rarest stories in hand. Wherefore the young Florentines were exceeding glad to have his company, when as they made a party of pleasure amongst themselves. It chanced one day, he being with certain folk at Moniughi, that the question was started among them of who were the best and oldest gentlemen of Florence. Some said the Uberti, others the Lamberti, and one this family and another that, according as it occurred to his mind. Which Scolza hearing, he fell a-laughing, and said, "Go to, addlepates that you are! You know not what you say. The best gentleman and the oldest, not only of Florence, but of all the world or the Maremma, are the cadges, a matter upon which all the Ficefolers and every one who knoweth them, as I do, are of accord, and lest you should understand it of others. I speak of the cadgers, your neighbors of Santa Maria Maggiore." When the young men, who looked for him to say otherwhat, heard this, they all made mock of him, and said, "Thou gullest us, as if we knew not the cadges, even as thou dost." "By the Evangels," replied Scolza, "I gull you not. Nay, I speak the truth, and if there be any here who will lay a supper thereon, to be given to the winner, and half a dozen companions of his choosing, I will willingly hold the wager. And I will do yet more for you, for I will abide by the judgment of whomsoever you will." Quoth one of them, called Neri Manini, "I am ready to try to win the supper in question," whereupon, having agreed together to take Piero di Fiorentino, in whose house they were, to judge, they betook themselves to him, followed by all the rest, who looked to see Scolza lose, and to make merry over his discomfiture, and recounted to him all that had passed. Piero, who was a discreet young man, having first heard Neri's argument, turned to Scolza and said to him, "And thou, how canst thou prove this that thou affirmest?" "How sayest thou?" answered Scolza. "Nay, I will prove it by such reasoning that not only thou, but he who beneath it, shall acknowledge that I speak sooth. You know that, the ancienter men are, the nobler they are, and so was it said but now among these. Now the cadgers are more ancient than anyone else, so that they are nobler, and showing you how they are the most ancient, I shall undoubtedly have won the wager. You must know, then, that the cadges were made by God the Lord in the days when he first began to learn to draw, but the rest of mankind were made after he knew how to draw. And, to assure yourselves that in this I say sooth, do but consider the cadges in comparison with other folk, whereas you see all the rest of mankind with faces well composed and duly proportioned, you may see the cadges, this with a visnomy very long and straight, and with a face out of all measure broad, One hath too long and another too short a nose, and a third hath a chin jutting out and turned upward, and huge jawbones that show as they were those of an ass, while some there be who have one eye bigger than the other, and other some who have one set lower than the other, like the faces that children use to make, when as they first begin to learn to draw. Wherefore, as I have already said, it is abundantly apparent that God the Lord made them, what time he was learning to draw, so that they are more ancient and consequently nobler than the rest of mankind. At this, both Piero, who was the judge, and Neri, who had wagered the supper, and all the rest, hearing Scalza's comical argument and remembering themselves, fell all a-laughing and affirmed that he was in the right, and had won the supper. For that the Caggios were assuredly the noblest and most ancient gentlemen that were to be found not in Florence alone, but in the world or the Maremma. Wherefore it was very justly said of Pamphilo, seeking to show the foulness of Messer Fari's visnomy, that it would have showed notably ugly on one of the Caggios. The seventh story. Madame Philippa, being found by her husband with a lover of hers and brought to justice, delivereth herself with a prompt and pleasant answer, and causeth modify the statute. Fiammetta was now silent, and all laughed yet at the novel argument used by Scalza for the ennoblement over all of the Caggios, when the queen enjoined Philostrato to tell, and he accordingly began to say, "It is everywise a fine thing, noble ladies, to know how to speak well, but I hold it yet goodlier to know how to do it whereas necessity requireth it, even as a gentlewoman, of whom I purpose to entertain you, knew well how to do on such wise that not only did she afford her hearers matter for mirth and laughter, but did herself loose from the toils of an ignominious death, as you shall presently hear. There was, then, aforetime, in the city of Prato, a statute in truth no less blameworthy than cruel, which, without making any distinction, ordained that any woman found by her husband in adultery with any her lover should be burnt, even as she who should be discovered to have sold her favors for money. What while the statute was in force, it befell that a noble and beautiful lady, by name Madame Philippa, who was of a singularly amorous complexion, was one night found by Rinaldo da Puglisi her husband, in her own chamber in the arms of Lazzarino da Guazzagliatri, a noble and handsome youth of that city, whom she loved even as herself. Rinaldo, seeing this, was sore enraged and scarce contained himself from falling upon them and slaying them, and but that he feared for himself, and he should ensue the promptings of his anger, he had certainly done it. However, he forbore from this, but could not refrain from seeking of the law of Prato that which it was not permitted him to accomplish with his own hand, to wit, the death of his wife. Having, therefore, very sufficient evidence to prove the lady's default, no sooner was the day come than, without taking other counsel, he lodged an accusation against her and caused summon her before the provost. Madame Philippa, being great of heart, as women commonly are who are verily in love, resolved, although counselled to the contrary by many of her friends and kinsfolk, to appear, choosing rather, confessing the truth, to die with an undaunted spirit, than, meanly fleeing, to live an outlaw in exile and confess herself unworthy of such a lover as he in whose arms she had been the foregoing night. Wherefore, presenting herself before the provost, attended by a great company of men and ladies, and exhorted of all to deny the charge, she demanded, with a firm voice and an assured air, what he would with her. The magistrate, looking upon her, and seeing her very fair and commendable of carriage, and according as her words testified, of a lofty spirit, began to have compassion of her, fearing lest she should confess somewhat, wherefore it should behoove him, for his own honour's sake, condemn her to die. However, having no choice but to question her of that which was laid to her charge, he said to her, "Madam, as you see, here is Rinaldo your husband, who complaineth of you, avouching himself to have found you in adultery with another man, and demanding that I should punish you therefore by putting you to death, according to the tenor of a statute which here obtaineth, but this I cannot do, except you confess it. Wherefore look well what you answer, and tell me if that be true whereof your husband impeacheth you." The lady, nowise dismayed, replied very cheerfully, "Sir, true it is that Rinaldo is my husband, and that he found me last night in the arms of Lazarino, wherein, for the great and perfect love I bear him, I have many a time been. Nor am I anywise minded to deny this. But, as I am assured you know, laws should be common to all and made with the consent of those whom they concern, and this is not the case with this statute, which is binding only upon us unhappy women, who might far better than men avail to satisfy many. More by token that, when it was made, not only did no woman yield consent thereunto, but none of us was even cited to do so, wherefore it may justly be styled not. However, and you choose, to the prejudice of my body and of your own soul, to be the executor of this unrighteous law, it resteth with you to do so. But, ere you proceed to adjudge aught, I pray you do me one slight favor, to wit, that you question my husband if at all times and as often as it pleased him, without ever saying him nay, I have or not vouchsafed him entire commodity of myself." Rinaldo, without waiting to be questioned of the provost, straightway made answer that undoubtedly the lady had, at his every request, accorded him his every pleasure of herself, whereupon, then, my lord provost, straightway rejoined she, "If he have still taken of me that which was needful and pleasing to him, what, I ask you, was or am I to do with that which remaineth over and above his requirements? Should I cast it to the dogs? Was it not far better to gratify withal a gentleman who loveth me more than himself, than to leave it waste or spoil?" Now well nigh all the people of Prato had flocked thither to the trial of such a matter and of so fair and famous a lady, and hearing so comical a question, they all, after much laughter, cried out as with one voice that she was in the right of it, and that she said well. Moreover, ere they departed thence, at the instance of the provost, they modified the cruel statute, and left it to apply to those women only who should for money make default to their husbands. Thereupon Rinaldo, having taken naught but shame by so fond an emprise, departed the court, and the lady returned in triumph to her own house, joyful and free, and in a manner raised up out of the fire. The 8th story. Fresco exhorteth his niece not to mirror herself in the glass, if, as she saith, it irketh her to see disagreeable folk. The story told by Philostrato at first touched the hearts of the listening ladies with some little shamefastness, and they gave token thereof by a modest redness that appeared upon their faces, but after looking one at another, they hearkened thereto, tittering the while and scarce able to abstain from laughing. As soon as he was come to the end thereof, the queen turned to Emilia and bade her follow on, whereupon, sighing no otherwise than as she had been aroused from a dream, she began, "Lovesome lasses, for that long thought hath held me far from here, I shall, to obey our queen, content myself with relating a story belike much slighter than that which I might have bethought myself to tell, had my mind been present here, recounting to you this silly default of a damsel, corrected by an uncle of hers. With a jocular retort, had she been woman enough to have apprehended it. A certain Fresco de Salatico, then, had a niece familiarly called Sciesca, who, having a comely face and person, though none of those angelical beauties that we have often seen aforetime, set so much store by herself and accounted herself so noble that she had gotten a habit of carping at both men and women and everything she saw, without anywise taking thought to herself, who was so much more fazhouse, froward and humorsome than any other of her sex, that nothing could be done to her liking. Beside all this, she was so prideful that, had she been of the blood royal of France, it had been overweening, and when she went abroad, she gave herself so many airs that she did not but make wry faces, as if there came to her a stench from whomsoever she saw or met. But, letting be many other vexatious and tiresome fashions of hers, it chanced one day that she came back to the house, where Fresco was, and seating herself near him, all full of airs and grimaces, did nothing but puff and blow, whereupon quoth he, "What meaneth this, Sciesca, that, today being a holiday, thou comest home so early?" To which she answered, all like to die away with affectation, It is true I have come back soon, for that I believe there were never in this city so many disagreeable and tiresome people, both men and women, as there are today. There passeth none about the streets, but is hateful to me as ill chance, and I do not believe there is a woman in the world to whom it is more irksome to see disagreeable folk than it is to me, wherefore I have returned thus early, not to see them. My lass, rejoined Fresco, to whom his niece's airs and graces were mighty displeasing, if disagreeable folk be so distasteful to thee as thou sayest, never mirror thyself in the glass. So thou wouldst live merry. But she, emptier than a reed, albeit her seemed she was a match for Solomon in wit, apprehended Fresco's true speech no better than a block. Nay, she said that she chose to mirror herself in the glass like other women. And so she abode in her folly and therein abideth yet. The ninth story. Guido Cavalcanti, with a pithy speech, courteously flouteth certain Florentine gentlemen who had taken him by surprise. The queen, seeing Emilia delivered of her story and that it rested with none other than herself to tell, saving him who was privileged to speak last, began thus, although, sprightly ladies, you have this day taken out of my mouth at the least 2 stories, whereof I had purposed to relate one, I have yet one left to tell, the end whereof compresseth a saying of such a fashion that none, peradventure, of such pertinence, hath yet been cited to us. You must know, then, that there were in our city, of times past, many goodly and commendable usances, whereof none is left there nowadays, thanks to the avarice that hath waxed therein with wealth and hath banished them all. Among these there was a custom to the effect that the gentlemen of the various quarters of Florence assembled together in divers places about the town and formed themselves into companies of a certain number, having a care to admit thereinto such only as might aptly bear the expense, whereof today the one and tomorrow the other, and so all in turn hold open house, each his day, for the whole company. At these banquets they often entertained both stranger gentlemen, whenas there came any thither, and those of the city, and on like wise, once at the least in the year. They clad themselves alike and rode in procession through the city on the most notable days and whiles they held passes of arms, especially on the chief holidays or whenas some glad news of victory or the like came to the city. Amongst these companies was one of Messer Beddo Brunelleschi, whereinto the latter and his companions had studied a main to draw Guido, son of Messer Cavalcanti da Cavalcanti, and not without cause, for that, besides being one of the best logicians in the world and an excellent natural philosopher, of which things, indeed, they recked little, he was very sprightly and well-bred, and a mighty well-spoken man, and knew better than any other to do everything that he would and that pertained unto a gentleman, more by token that he was very rich and knew wonder well how to entertain whomsoever he deemed deserving of honor. But Messer Beddo had never been able to win and to have him, and he and his companions believed that this betided for that Guido, being whiles engaged in abstract speculations, became much distraught from mankind, and for that he inclined somewhat to the opinion of the Epicureans. It was reported among the common folk that these his speculations consisted only in seeking if it might be discovered that God was not. It chanced one day that Guido set out from Ordo San Michele and came by way of the Corso degli Ademari, the which was oftentimes his road, to San Giovanni, round about which there were at that present divers great marble tombs, which are nowadays at Santa Reparata, and many others. As he was between the columns of porphyry there and the tombs in question and the door of the church, which was shut, Messer Beddo and his company, coming a horseback along the Piazza di Santa Reparata, espied him among the tombs and said, "Let us go plague him." Accordingly, spurring their horses, they charged all down upon him in sport, and coming upon him ere he was aware of them, said to him, "Guido, thou refusest to be of our company, but, harkee, whenas thou shalt have found that God is not, what wilt thou have accomplished?" Guido, seeing himself hemmed in by them, answered promptly, "Gentlemen, you may say what you will to me in your own house." Then, laying his hand on one of the great tombs aforesaid, and being very nimble of body, he took a spring and, alighting on the other side, made off, having thus rid himself of them. The gentlemen abode, looking one upon another, and fell a saying that he was a crack-brain, and that this that he had answered them amounted to not seeing that there where they were they had no more to do than all the other citizens, nor Guido himself less than any of themselves. But Messer Beddo turned to them and said, "It is you who are the crack-brains, if you have not apprehended him. He hath courteously and in a few words given us the sharpest rebuke in the world, for that, and you consider aright, these tombs are the houses of the dead, seeing they are laid and abide therein, and these, saith he, are our house." Meaning thus to show us that we and other foolish and unlettered men are, compared with him and other men of learning, worse than dead folk. Wherefore, being here, we are in our own house. Thereupon each understood what Guido had meant to say, and was abashed, nor ever plagued him more, but held Messer Beddo thenceforward a gentleman of a subtle wit and an understanding. The 10th story. Frasipola promiseth certain country folk to show them one of the angel Gabriel's feathers, and finding coals in place thereof, avoucheth these latter to be of those which roasted St. Florence. Each of the company being now quit of his story, Dionio perceived that it rested with him to tell, whereupon, without awaiting more formal commandment, he began on this wise, silence having first been imposed on those who commended Guido's pregnant retort. "Charming ladies, albeit I am privileged to speak of that which most liketh me, I purpose not today to depart from the matter whereof you have all very aptly spoken, but, ensuing in your footsteps, I mean to show you how cunningly a friar of the order of St. Anthony, by name Frasipola, contrived with a sudden shift to extricate himself from a snare which had been set for him by two young men, nor should it irk you if, for the complete telling of the story, I enlarge somewhat in speaking. And you consider the sun, which is yet a middleward in the sky. Certaldo, as you may have heard, is a burg of Val di Elsa situate in our country, which, small though it be, was once inhabited by gentlemen and men of substance, and thither, for that he found good pasture there. One of the friars of the order of St. Anthony was long used to resort once a year, to get in the alms bestowed by simpletons upon him and his brethren. His name was Frasipola, and he was gladly seen there, no less belike, for his name's sake than for other reasons, seeing that these parts produce onions that are famous throughout all Tuscany. This Frasipola was little of person, red-haired and merry of countenance, the jolliest rascal in the world, and to boot, for all he was no scholar. He was so fine a talker and so ready of wit that those who knew him not would not only have esteemed him a great rhetorician, but had avouched him to be Tully himself, or maybe Quintilian. And he was gossip or friend or well-wisher to well nigh every one in the country. One August among others he betook himself thither according to his wont, and on a Sunday morning, all the good men and good wives of the villages around being come to hear mass at the parish church, he came forward, when as it seemed to him time, and said, "Gentlemen and ladies, it is, as you know, your usance to send every year to the poor of our Lord Baron St. Anthony of your corn and of your oats, this little and that much, according to his means and his devoutness, to the intent that the blessed St. Anthony may keep watch over your beeves and asses and swine and sheep, and besides this you use to pay, especially such of you as are inscribed into our company, that small due which is payable once a year. To collect these I have been sent by my superior, to wit, my Lord Abbot, wherefore, with the blessing of God, you shall, after none, when as you hear the bells ring, come hither without the church, where I will make preachment to you after the wonted fashion, and you shall kiss the cross. Moreover, for that I know you all to be great devotees of our Lord St. Anthony, I will, as an especial favor, show you a very holy and goodly relic, which I myself brought aforetime from the holy lands beyond seas, and that is one of the angel Gabriel's feathers, which remained in the Virgin Mary's chamber, when as he came to announce to her in Nazareth. This said, he broke off and went on with his mass. Now, when he said this, there were in the church, among many others, two roguish young fellows, hight one Giovanni del Braganiera and the other Biagio Pizzini, who, after laughing with one another a while over Frasipola's relic, took counsel together, for all they were great friends and cronies of his, to play him some trick in the matter of the feather in question. Accordingly, having learned that he was to dine that morning with a friend of his in the burg, they went down into the street as soon as they knew him to be at table, and betook themselves to the inn where he had alighted, purposing that Biagio should hold his servant in parley, whilst Giovanni should search his baggage for the feather aforesaid, whatever it might be, and carry it off, to see what he should say to the people of the matter. Fra Sepola had a servant, whom some called Guccio Bellina, others Guccio Imbrata, and yet others Guccia Porco, and who was such a scurvy knave that Lippo Topo never wrought his like, inasmuch as his master used oftentimes to jest of him with his cronies, and say, "My servant hath in him 9 defaults, such that, were one of them in Solomon or Aristotle or Seneca, it would suffice to mar all their worth, all their wit, and all their sanctity. Consider, then, what a man he must be, who hath all 9 of them, and in whom there is neither worth, nor wit, nor sanctity." Being questioned whiles what were these 9 defaults, and having put them into doggerel rhyme, he would answer, "I will tell you. He's a liar, a sloven, a slugabed, disobedient, neglectful, ill-bred, o'erweening, foul-spoken, a dunderhead, beside which he hath divers other peccadillos, whereof it booteth not to speak. But what is most laughable of all his fashions is that, wherever he goeth, he is still for taking a wife and hiring a house, for, having a big black greasy beard, him seemeth he is so exceeding handsome and agreeable that he conceiteth himself all the women who see him fall in love with him, and if you let him alone, he would run after them all till he lost his girdle. Sooth to say, he is of great assistance to me, for that none can ever seek to speak with me so secretly but he must needs hear his share, and if it chance that I be questioned of aught, he is so fearful lest I should not know how to answer, that he straightway answereth for me both aye and no, as he judgeth sortable." Now Fra Sepola, in leaving him at the inn, had bidden him look well that none touched his gear, and more particularly his saddlebags, for that therein were the sacred things. But Guccio, who was fonder of the kitchen than the nightingale of the green boughs, especially if he scented some serving wench there, and who had seen in that of the inn a gross fat cook maid, undersized and ill-made, with a pair of paps that showed like 2 manure baskets and a face like a cadger's, all sweaty, greasy, and smoky, leaving Fra Sepola's chamber and all his gear to care for themselves, swooped down upon the kitchen, even as the vulture swoopeth upon carrion, and, seating himself by the fire, for all it was August, entered into discourse with the wench in question, whose name was Nuda, telling her that he was by rights a gentleman and had more than 9 millions of florins, beside that which he had to give others, which was rather more than less, and that he could do and say God only knew what. Moreover, without regard to his bonnet, whereon was grease enough to have seasoned the cauldron of Altapatio, and his doublet all torn and pieced and enamelled with filth about the collar and under the armpits, with more spots and patches of divers colors than ever had Turkey or India stuffs, and his shoes all broken and hose unsewn, he told her, as he had been the Sieur de Chatillon, that he meant to clothe her and trick her out anew and deliver her from the wretchedness of abiding with others, and bring her to hope of better fortune, if without any great wealth in possession, and many other things, which, for all he delivered them very earnestly, all turned to wind and came to naught, as did most of his enterprises. The 2 young men, accordingly, found Guccio busy about Nuda, whereat they were well pleased, for that it spared them half their pains, and entering Fra Sepola's chamber, which they found open, the first thing that came under their examination was the saddlebags wherein was the feather. In these they found, enveloped in a great taffetas wrapper, a little casket, and opening this latter, discovered therein a parrot's tail feather, which they concluded must be that which the friar had promised to show the people of Certaldo. And certes he might lightly cause it to be believed in those days, for that the refinements of Egypt had not yet made their way save into a small part of Tuscany, as they have since done in very great abundance, to the undoing of all Italy. And wherever they may have been some little known, in those parts they were well nigh altogether unknown of the inhabitants, nay the rude honesty of the ancients yet enduring there. Not only had they never set eyes on a parrot, but were far from having ever heard tell of such a bird. The young men, then, rejoiced at finding the feather, laid hands on it, and not to leave the casket empty, filled it with some coals they saw in a corner of the room, and shut it again. Then, putting all things in order as they had found them, they made off in high glee with the feather, without having been seen, and began to await what Fressipoli should say, when he found the coals in place thereof. The simple men and women who were in the church, hearing that they were to see the angel Gabriel's feather after none, returned home, as soon as Mass was over, and neighbor telling it to neighbor and gossip to gossip. No sooner had they all dined than so many men and women flocked to the burg that it would scarce hold them, all looking eagerly to see the aforesaid feather. Frasipola, having well dined and after slept a while, arose a little after none, and hearing of the great multitude of country folk come to see the feather, sent to bid Guccio Imbrata come thither with the bells, and bring his saddlebags. Guccio, tearing himself with difficulty away from the kitchen and Nuda, betook himself with the things required to the appointed place, whither coming, out of breath, for that the water he had drunken had made his belly swell amain, he repaired, by his master's commandment, to the church door and fell to ringing the bells lustily. When all the people were assembled there, Frasipola, without observing that aught of his had been meddled with, began his preachment and said many words anent his affairs, after which, thinking to come to the showing of the angel Gabriel's feather, he first recited the Confiteor with the utmost solemnity and let kindle a pair of flambeaux. Then, pulling off his bonnet, he delicately unfolded the taffeta's wrapper and brought out the casket. Having first pronounced certain ejaculations in praise and commendation of the angel Gabriel and of his relic, he opened the casket, and seeing it full of coals, suspected not Guccio Bellina of having played him this trick, for that he knew him not to be man enough, nor did he curse him for having kept ill watch lest others should do it, but silently cursed himself for having committed to him the care of his gear, knowing him, as he did, to be negligent, disobedient, careless, and forgetful. Nevertheless, without changing color, he raised his eyes and hands to heaven and said, so as to be heard of all, O God, praised be still thy puissance. Then, shutting the casket and turning to the people, gentlemen and ladies, quoth he, you must know that, whilst I was yet very young, I was dispatched by my superior to those parts where the sun riseth, and it was expressly commanded me that I should seek till I found the privileges of porcellana, which, though they cost nothing to seal, are much more useful to others than to us. On this errand I set out from Venice, and passed through Borgo de Grisi, whence, riding through the kingdom of Algarva and Baldacca, I came to Perione, and from there, not without thirst, I came after a while into Sardinia. But what putteth it to set out to you in detail all the lands explored by me? Passing the Straits of San Giorgio, I came into Truffia and Buffia, countries much inhabited and with great populations, and thence into the land of Menzogna, where I found great plenty of our brethren and of friars of other religious orders, who all went about those parts, shunning unease for the love of God, recking little of others' travail, when as they saw their own advantage to ensue, and spending none other money than such as was uncoined. Thence I passed into the land of the Abruzzi, where the men and women go in clogs over the mountains, clothing the swine in their own guts, and a little farther I found folk who carried bread on sticks and wine in bags. From this I came to the mountains of the Bocci, where all the waters run downhill, and in brief, I made my way so far inward that I won at last even to India Pastanaca, where I swear to you, by the habit I wear on my back, that I saw hedgebills fly. A thing incredible to whoso hath not seen it. But of this Maso del Saggio will confirm me, whom I found there a great merchant, cracking walnuts and selling the shells by retail. Being unable to find that which I went seeking, for that thence one goeth thither by water, I turned back and arrived in those holy countries, where, in summer years, cold bread is worth 4 farthings a loaf, and the hot goeth for nothing. There I found the venerable Father my Lord Blamenot Anit Please You, the very worshipful Patriarch of Jerusalem, who, For reverence of the habit I have still worn of my Lord Baron St. Anthony, would have me see all the holy relics that he had about him, and which were so many that, and I sought to recount them all to you, I should not come to an end thereof in several miles. However, not to leave you disconsolate, I will tell you some thereof. First, he showed me the finger of the Holy Ghost, as whole and sound as ever it was, and the forelock of the seraph that appeared to St. Francis, and one of the nails of the cherubim, and one of the ribs of the verbum caro get thee to the windows, and some of the vestments of the holy Catholic faith, and divers rays of the star that appeared to the three wise men in the east, and a vial of the sweat of St. Michael, when as he fought with the devil, and the jawbone of the death of St. Lazarus and others. And for that I made him a free gift of the steeps of Monte Morello in the vernacular, and of some chapters of the Caprizio, which he had long gone seeking. He made me a sharer in his holy relics, and gave me one of the teeth of the Holy Rood, and somewhat of the sound of the bells of Solomon's temple in a vial, and the feather of the angel Gabriel, whereof I have already bespoken you, and one of the patens of Saint Gerard de Villa Magna, which not long since at Florence I gave to Gerard de Bonsi, who hath a particular devotion for that saint, and he gave me also of the coals wherewith the most blessed martyr St. Lawrence was roasted, all which things I devoutly brought home with me, and yet have. True it is that my superior hath never suffered me to show them till such time as he should be certified if they were the very things or not. But now that, by certain miracles performed by them and by letters received from the Patriarch, he hath been made certain of this, he hath granted me leave to show them, and I, fearing to trust them to others, still carry them with me. Now I carry the angel Gabriel's feather, so it may not be marred, in one casket, and the coals wherewith St. Lawrence was roasted in another, the which are so like one to other, that it hath often happened to me to take one for the other. And so hath it betided me at this present, for that, thinking to bring hither the casket wherein was the feather, I have brought that wherein are the coals. The which I hold not to have been an error, nay, meseemeth certain that it was God's will, and that he himself placed the casket with the coals in my hands, especially now I mind me that the feast of St. Lawrence is but 2 days hence, wherefore God, willing that, by showing you the coals wherewith he was roasted, I should rekindle in your hearts the devotion it behoveth you have for him, caused me take, not the feather as I purposed, but the blessed coals extinguished by the sweat of that most holy body. So, O my blessed children, put off your bonnets and draw near devoutly to behold them. But first I would have you knew that whoso is scored with these coals, in the form of the sign of the cross, may rest assured, for the whole year to come, that fire shall not touch him, but he shall feel it. Having thus spoken, he opened the casket, chanting the while a canticle in praise of St. Lawrence, and showed the coals, which after the simple multitude had a while beheld with reverent admiration, they all crowded about Frasipola, and making him better offerings than they were used, besought him to touch them withal. Accordingly, taking the coals in hand, he fell to making the biggest crosses for which he could find room upon their white smocks and doublets, and upon the veils of the women, avouching that how much soever the coals diminished in making these crosses, they after grew again in the casket, as he had many a time proved. On this wise he crossed all the people of Certaldo, to his no small profit, and thus, by his ready wit and presence of mind, he baffled those who, by taking the feather from him, had thought to baffle him, and who, being present at his preachment, and hearing the rare shift employed by him, and from how far he had taken it, and with what words, had so laughed that they thought to have cracked their jaws. Then, after the common folk had departed, they went up to him, and with all the mirth in the world discovered to him that which they had done, and after restored him his feather, which next year stood him in as good stead as the coals had done that day. This story afforded unto all the company alike the utmost pleasure and solace, and it was much laughed of all at Frasipola, and particularly of his pilgrimage and the relics seen and brought back by him. The queen, seeing the story and likewise her sovereignty at an end, rose to her feet and put off the crown, which she set laughingly on Dionio's head, saying, "It is time, Dionio, that thou prove awhile what manner charge it is to have ladies to govern and guide." Be thou, then, king and rule on such wise that, in the end, we may have reason to give ourselves joy of thy governance. Dioneo took the crown and answered, laughing, You may often enough have seen much better kings than I mean chess kings, but an you obey me as a king should in truth be obeyed. I will cause you enjoy that without which assuredly no entertainment is ever complete in its gladness. But let that talk be, I will rule as best I know. Then, sending for the seneschal according to the wonted usance, he orderly enjoined him of that which he should do during the continuance of his seigneury, and after said, Noble ladies, it hath in divers manners been devised of human industry, and of the various chances of fortune, insomuch that, had not Dame Lysiska come hither a while agone and found me matter with her prate for our morrow's relations, I misdoubt me I should have been long at pains to find a subject of discourse. As you heard, she avouched that she had not a single gossip who had come to her husband a maid, and added that she knew right well how many and what manner tricks married women yet played their husbands. But letting be the first part, which is a childish matter, methinketh the second should be an agreeable subject for discourse, wherefore I will and ordain it that, since Lysiska hath given us occasion therefor, it be discoursed tomorrow of the tricks which, or for love or for their own preservation, women have heretofore played their husbands, with or without the latter's cognizance thereof. It seemed to some of the ladies that to discourse of such a matter would ill beseem them, and they prayed him, therefore, to change the theme proposed. Wherefore answered he, Ladies, I am no less cognizant than yourselves of that which I have ordained. And that which you would fain allege to me availed not to deter me from ordaining it, considering that the times are such that, provided men and women are careful to eschew unseemly actions, all liberty of discourse is permitted. Know you not that, for the malignity of the season, the judges have forsaken the tribunals, that the laws, as well divine as human, are silent, and full license is conceded unto every one for the preservation of his life? Wherefore, if your modesty allow itself some little freedom in discourse, not with intent to ensue it with aught of unseemly in deeds, but to afford yourselves and others diversion, I see not with what plausible reason any can blame you in the future. Moreover, your company, from the first day of our assembling until this present, hath been most decorous, nor, for aught that hath been said here, doth it appear to me that its honor hath anywise been sullied. Again, who is there knoweth not your virtue? Which, not to say mirthful discourse, but even fear of death I do not believe could avail to shake. And to tell you the truth, whosoever should hear that you shrank from devising bytimes of these toys would be apt to suspect that you were guilty in the matter and were therefore unwilling to discourse thereof. To say nothing of the fine honor you would do me in that, I having been obedient unto all, you now, having made me your king, seek to lay down the law to me, and not to discourse of the subject which I propose. Put off, then, this misdoubtance, apter to mean minds than to yours, and good luck to you. Let each of you bethink herself of some goodly story to tell. When the ladies heard this, they said it should be as he pleased, whereupon he gave them all leave to do their several pleasures until supper time. The sun was yet high, for that the discoursement had been brief, wherefore Dioneo having addressed himself to play at tables with the other young men, Elisa called the other ladies apart, and said to them, Since we have been here, I have still wished to carry you to a place very near at hand, whither methinketh none of you hath ever been, and which is called the Ladies' Valley, but have never yet found an occasion of bringing you thither unto today. Wherefore, as the sun is yet high, I doubt not but, an it please you come thither, you will be exceeding well pleased to have been there. They answered that they were ready, and calling one of their maids, set out upon their way, without letting the young men know aught thereof, nor had they gone much more than a mile when they came to the Ladies' Valley. They entered therein by a very straight way, on one side whereof ran a very clear streamlet, and saw it as fair and as delectable, especially at that season when as the heat was great, as most might be conceived. According to that which one of them after told me, the plain that was in the valley was as round as if it had been traced with the compass, albeit it seemed the work of nature and not of art, and was in circuit a little more than half a mile, encompassed about with 6 little hills not over high, on the summit of each of which stood a palace builded, in guise of a goodly castle. The sides of these hills went sloping gradually downward to the plain on such wise as we see in amphitheaters. The degrees descend in ordered succession from the highest to the lowest, still contracting their circuit. And of these slopes those which looked toward the south were all full of vines and olives and almonds and cherries and figs and many another kind of fruit-bearing trees, without a span thereof being wasted, whilst those which faced the North Star were all covered with thickets of dwarf oaks and ashes and other trees as green and straight as might be. The middle plain, which had no other inlet than that whereby the ladies were come thither, was full of firs and cypresses and laurels and various sorts of pines, as well arrayed and ordered as if the best artist in that kind had planted them. And between these little or no sun, even at its highest, made its way to the ground, which was all one meadow of very fine grass, thick sown with flowers purpurine and others. Moreover, that which afforded no less delight than other what was a little stream, which ran down from a valley that divided two of the hills aforesaid, and falling over cliffs of live rock, made a murmur very delectable to hear, what while it showed from afar, as it broke over the stones, like so much quicksilver jetting out, under pressure of somewhat, into fine spray. As it came down into the little plain, it was there received into a fair channel and ran very swiftly into the mid-dais thereof, where it formed a lakelet, such as the townsfolk made whiles, by way of fish-pond, in their gardens, whenas they have a commodity thereof. This lakelet was no deeper than a man's stature, breast high, and its waters being exceeding clear and altogether untroubled with any admixture, it showed its bottom to be of a very fine gravel, the grains whereof whoso had naught else to do might, and he would have availed to number, nor, looking into the water, was the bottom alone to be seen, nay, but so many fish fleeting hither and thither that, over and above the pleasure thereof, it was a marvel to behold, nor was it enclosed with other banks than the very soil of the meadow, which was the goodlier thereabout in so much as it received the more of its moisture. The water that abounded over and above the capacity of the lake was received into another channel, whereby, issuing forth of the little valley, it ran off into the lower parts. Hither then came the young ladies, and after they had gazed all about and much commended the place, they took counsel together to bathe, for that the heat was great, and that they saw the lakelet before them and were in no fear of being seen. Accordingly, bidding their serving maid abide over against the way whereby one entered there, and look if any should come and give them notice thereof, they stripped themselves naked, all seven, and entered the lake, which hid their white bodies no otherwise than as a thin glass would do with a vermeil rose. Then, they being therein, and no troubling of the water ensuing thereof, they fell, as best they might, to faring hither and thither in pursuit of the fish, which had a neath where to hide themselves, and seeking to take them with the naked hand. After they had abidden a while in such joyous pastime, and had taken some of the fish, they came forth of the lakelet, and clad themselves anew. Then, unable to commend the place more than they had already done, and them seeming time to turn homeward, they set out, with soft step, upon their way, discoursing much of the goodliness of the valley. They reached the palace betimes, and there found the young men yet at play where they had left them, to whom quoth Pampinea, laughing, "We have e'en stolen a march on you today." "How?" asked Dioneo. "Do you begin to do deeds ere you come to say words?" "Ay, my lord," answered she, and related to him at large whence they came, and how the place was fashioned, and how far distant thence, and that which they had done. The king, hearing tell of the goodliness of the place and desirous of seeing it, caused straightway order the supper, which being dispatched to the general satisfaction, the three young men, leaving the ladies, betook themselves with their servants to the valley, and having viewed it in every part, for that none of them had ever been there before, extolled it for one of the goodliest things in the world. Then, for that it grew late, after they had bathed and donned their clothes, they returned home, where they found the ladies dancing around, to the accompaniment of a song sung by Fiammetta. The dance ended, they entered with them into a discourse of the ladies' valley, and said much in praise and commendation thereof. Moreover, the king, sending for the seneschal, bade him look that the dinner be made ready there on the following morning, and have sundry beds carried thither, in case any should have a mind to lie or sleep there for nooning. After which he let bring lights and wine and confections, and the company having some deal refreshed themselves, he commanded that all should address themselves to dancing. Then, Pamphilo having, at his commandment, set up a dance, the king turned to Elisa and said courteously to her, "Fair damsel, thou hast today done me the honor of the crown, and I purpose this evening to do thee that of the song. Wherefore look thou sing such an one as most liketh thee." Elisa answered, smiling, that she would well, and with dulcet voice began on this wise: "Love, from thy clutches could I but win free. Hardly, methinks, again shall any other hook take hold on me. I entered in thy wars a youngling maid, thinking thy strife was utmost peace and sweet, and all my weapons on the ground I laid, as one secure, undoubting of defeat. But thou, false tyrant, with rapacious heat, didst fall on me amain, with all the grapnels of thine armory, then, wound about and fettered with thy chains. To him, who for my death an evil hour was born, thou gav'st me, bounden, full of pains, and bitter tears, and sign within his power. He hath me and his rules so harsh and dour, no sighs can move the swain, nor all my wasting plaints to set me free. My prayers, the wild winds bear them all away. He hearkeneth unto none, and none will hear. Wherefore each hour my torment waxeth I cannot die, albeit life irks me drear. Ah, Lord, have pity on my heavy cheer. Do that I seek in vain, and give him bounden in thy chains to me. And this thou wilt not, at the least, undo, the bonds ere one of hope that knitted were. Alack, O Lord, thereof to thee I sue. For, an thou do it, yet to waxen fair, again I trust, as was my use whilere. And, being quit of pain, myself with white flowers and with red besee." Elisa ended her song with a very plaintive sigh, and albeit all marvelled at the words thereof, yet was there none who might conceive what it was that caused her sing thus. But the king, who was in a merry mood, calling for Tindaro, bade him bring out his bagpipes, to the sound whereof he let dance many dances, after which, a great part of the night being now past, he bade each go sleep. Here endeth the 6th day of the Decameron. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the channel by hitting the subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon to receive new content notifications.